All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to CHRTC 309. So this is once again and always sociology of youth and religion. Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to be delving into life outcomes, right? So are there differences, say, between religious teens and non-religious teens, right? That's kind of the question that we want to ask. Um, you know, is there something that at the end of the day makes religious teens different? So we're going to dig into that. We'll see kind of how that goes, and after that, we'll look at emerging adults as well in a separate kind of lecture. Moving into, of course, kind of considering this bigger question of like, what does religion do? Is religion good for young people? Is it something that is okay if young people abandon, or is it ultimately kind of a loss? And here, we're going to be digging back into, of course, data from the National Study of Youth and Religion.
So one of the key psychological measures that people have often been worried about when they talk about the link between religion and life outcomes is suicidality and suicide. And this really goes back to Durkheim, right? One of the three kind of founders of sociology as a discipline. Durkheim's early study of religion really cued in on suicide. And he basically kind of talks about suicide in two different ways. So either egoistic or anomic suicide, which is basically, a suicide that comes from people being socially isolated, right? From being set apart from society, or altruistic suicide, which is basically the suicide that comes from people, giving themselves completely to the group, right? So either you're completely cut off and you're egoistic or anomic, or you're totally dedicated to the group, or you're altruistic. So altruistic suicide might look something like, in war, you throw yourself on a grenade to save the rest of your brigade, or whatever it happens to be, right? Um, Between those things, basically, he sees social solidarity as being the key to avoiding suicide. So in that early suicide study that Durkheim did, what we basically saw, or what he argued, was that the greater social solidarity people felt, the less likely they were to commit suicide, except in extreme cases, right, of something like a military unit. So basically, when he looked around, kind of taking social statistics on suicide from a bunch of different European countries, what he said was, we see certain groups committing suicide at much lower rates. And particularly, he cued in on Jews. And Jews basically committed suicide far less than Christians did, despite the fact that they had more mental disorders. They typically had more mental disorders than Christians did. And where you had Christians, there were differences between Christian groups. Catholics committed suicide less than Protestants. Again, there's strong, you know, prescriptions against suicide in Catholicism. But one of the other things that Durkheim noted is they were more likely to attend church and have deeper community ties than Protestants did. And therefore, what he said is basically that people commit suicide when they either have too much or too little social solidarity. So in that way, and I mean, these results have broadly held true, as we'll see on the next slide. Okay, so the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychology published this report a couple of years ago. Um, Basically, a study of 90,000 nurses between 1996 and 2000, so a 4-year period, and looking at how often they committed suicide. And what they found was, within this group of 90,000 nurses, those who attended church once a week were less likely to commit suicide than those who never attended church. Devout Protestants were 7 times more likely to commit suicide than their Catholic peers. Catholic women who attended Mass twice or more a week never committed suicide. So the more engaged you were with your religious community, the less likely you were to commit suicide. And like the most surprising finding, so among the almost 7,000 Catholic women who said they attended Mass once a week or more, there were 0 suicides in this particular study. And again, this is probably linked to a strong sense of community, an outlet for anxiety that religious communities provide. And it might also have to do with the strong religious prescription against suicide. Though the authors think that's too simple, that it probably goes back to this kind of Durkheimian um, social solidarity, right? That basically the social solidarity within these groups was so much higher that it tended to lead to less frequent suicide. Okay, so you can see what I've done here, is taken a few quotes out of this particular study just so you can kind of read it over. If you're interested, please email me and I can send you the full study. But basically, what we see broadly, right, in this cohort of U.S. women, frequent religious service attendance associated with significantly lower risk of suicide, and I do think that's worth noting. So that finding, is supported by other studies. So in this book, Girls on the Edge, psychologist and pediatrician Leonard Sachs, looking at girls kind of on the whole, suggests that basically girls who practice any kind of spirituality, whether it be yoga or meditation, or whether they're deeply Christian or Muslim or Hindu or whatever, tend to suffer from eating disorders, self-harm, and a bunch of other antisocial behaviors far less than those who practice no spirituality. So spirituality in general seems to be good for girls. And the reason is not altogether clear, right? We don't actually really know why, and especially why this difference between males and females. But the research that Sachs cites anyway, it seems fairly consistent, that basically girls benefit from it greatly, boys not so much. Okay, so we're going to go out a little broader here on these next slides. So we're going to go back to the National Study of Youth and Religion and Christian Smith's study, the work he did initially with Melinda Lundquist Denton, and then in subsequent lessons we're going to go and look forward to some of the work that came out of later waves of the National Study of Youth and Religion, and see, what's the story here? What does being religious tend to do to adolescents, right, to teenagers and emerging adults? So one of the things that they found in the National Study of Religion in that first wave, and one of the conclusions that they come to in the first book, in Soul Searching, was basically that most teenagers tend to think that religion is a good thing, that religion is positive, that it's a good influence on people's lives, that it's good for forming morals, though broadly they didn't feel that it was particularly consequential or influential in their own lives. Faith, basically they said helps teens feel good about themselves and maybe behave better, maybe teach them morals, although most felt that their non-religious peers could be just as good and happy as those who were believers. Many of those, even those who were religious, said they really didn't know how their lives would be any different if they were not religious. And basically, Smith and Denton kind of asked the following question: is, do teenagers really know the truth about their own lives and how things like religion influence their lives? So basically what they did is they took a bunch of the data, and in collecting this data, they had collected a bunch of data on both the spiritual lives of teenagers in the United States, as well as a bunch of other data on kind of risk behaviors. Things that they do, whether they have sex, whether they take drugs, how well they do in school, and all of these, how well they get along with parents and peers, siblings, and all of these things. And they kind of use this data to compare the teens that were religious and non-religious, and ask the question, right, really, is faith consequential in the lives of American teenagers or not? Like, is there a significant difference between those who say they're religious and those who say they're non-religious? And the conclusion they came to, which is in the chapter that I gave you in the reader, basically they said, although many teenagers cannot see it, according to the findings of the National Study of Youth and Religion, the difference between more religious and less religious teens in the United States are actually significant and consistent across every outcome measured. And the emphasis there is mine, but it's across every outcome measures. It's not, a couple of measures, they're better here, but not better here. Basically what they found was that, across all the measures they took, religious teenagers performed better in those things. Okay, so what did they measure? Risk behaviors, we'll look at those. Quality of family and adult relationships, moral reasoning and behavior, community participation, media consumption, sexual activity, and emotional well-being. And so across all those categories, religious teenagers score better than non-religious teenagers. Okay, so basically, in order to measure religiosity, they took a bunch of different dimensions of religion. So basically, they asked about beliefs, they asked about spiritual practices, so church attendance, prayer, whether they'd had spiritual experiences, their religious affiliation, whether they considered themselves part of a religious group, and their participation in that group or other para-religious groups. So they were able to classify about 63% of the youth that they had surveyed into 4 broad categories. The most religious, that they call the devoted, which they said is about 8% of young Americans who attend religious services weekly or more. They say faith is very important, or extremely important in their daily life. They feel extremely close to God. They're currently involved in religious youth groups, pray a few times a week or more, and read scriptures once or twice a month. Okay, those were the devoted, the most religious American teenagers. The regulars, they attend religious services 2 to 3 times a month or weekly. Faith, they said, is not very important in their everyday life, and their other practices were variable, but they tend to, pray, read scriptures, be involved in religious youth groups less than the devoted. The sporadics, 17% of American youth, who attended religious services a few times a year or once a month. Faith, they said, is not very important, but they still feel very or extremely close to God. And then all those other factors were variable. And then the disengaged, who never went to religious services or attended many times a year but identified as non-religious. Faith, somewhat or not very important. Feel only somewhat close to God or less close. Man, they prayed maybe 1 or 2 times and read scriptures 1 to 2 times a month or less. So those are broad categories, of course. Like I said, 63% of US teens fit neatly into these categories, and 37 were categorized as other or mixed, because not everybody fits into these categories. And I mean, this is just kind of, this is a fairly sophisticated metric. Like often what people are doing when they're doing this kind of study is using much simpler ways of combining the data, simply assigning a value to each of the kind of answers people give and creating an overall score, which is what I've done in some of the work that I've done. And that categorizes everybody, but this is a really sophisticated metric, which you could tell by the fact that there are 37% that score outside of these categories. Okay, so I mean, if you've ever taken some advanced stats classes, you'll maybe be familiar with this. But basically, what they did, right? So basically, to try not to skew the data, is they used a statistical calculation called multivariate regression, which is very, very sophisticated, to control for 7 key demographic factors. So gender, right? Because we know that females tend to be more religious than males. So they wanted to control for some of that, and they oversampled females a little bit in the study. Age, race, region of residence, right? Because we have regional differences. The South is more religious. The Northeast and Pacific Coast are less religious, so they tried to balance those out by weighting the factors. Parental marital status, because we know, again, divorce and these things can affect religiosity. Parental education and family income. The more educated you are as an evangelical, for instance, the more likely you are to be highly religious. And family income, middle-class people are more likely to be religious than poor people. And so they balanced all these out by weighting the different factors. So they tried to remove as much of the distortion as possible. Okay, so when we look at risk behaviors, right, what we see broadly, through these percentages was that the devoted, if you kind of look across the risk factors, or if you look at those who say that they, never did certain things, you can see, broadly speaking, that those who say that they are devoted are much, much less likely to engage in risk behaviors, right? So smoke cigarette, only 7% of American teenagers overall said they did. Only 1% of the devoted, compared to 14% of the disengaged. Drinking alcohol, 5% said they did it weekly or more. None of the devoted said they did, whereas 11% of the disengaged said they did. Smoking marijuana, again, 4% said they did so regularly. None for the devoted. 8% of the disengaged. Tried once or twice even, a pretty low measure. Only 6% of the devoted said they had, versus 16% of the disengaged. And 93% of the devoted said they had never tried marijuana, compared to only 63% of the disengaged. But even for the regulars, that number is only 78. Cutting class, right? 6 or more times. In the last year, only 2% of the devoted said they had, compared to 7% overall, and 12% of the disengaged. 76% of the devoted said they never cut class. That is compared to 64% overall. And then only 48% of the religiously disengaged said they never cut class. School grades are usually kind of in the lower quartile, right? The C's, the D's, and the F's. 10% overall of teenagers, 14% of the disengaged, but only 3% of the devoted. Only 1%, only 5% said they had been suspended or expelled overall. 9% for the disengaged, 1% for the devoted. Regulars 3%, sporadic 6%. Parents saying their teen is fairly or very rebellious, 13% overall, much higher. For the disengaged. The regulars and the sporadics are both right at the average, whereas the devoted, it's only 3%, so it's 10% below the national average. And parents report that teen has a somewhat or very bad temper. 32% of the devoted still did, but that's still much lower than the 43% overall, or the 49% for those who were religiously disengaged. So in terms of risk behaviors and getting into trouble, devoted teenagers were far less likely to do so, and were far more likely to have good kind of pro-social behaviors than those that are disengaged. So here, when we talk about media consumption, what we can say is again, broadly, that the devoted just seem to have somewhat healthier media habits than the religiously disengaged. And all the other groups, right? They use media less. They're less likely to access pornography. When they do access pornography, they access less of it. They're spending less time viewing it. And these are all things broadly that I think we can say are healthy. Donna Freitas, so we're back to Donna Freitas again after leaving her for such a short time, wrote another book. This is 2017's The Happiness Effect. Really interesting book. And 2018's The Happiness Effect. Really interesting book. Really enjoyed it. Highly recommended. One of the findings, and it's a book that goes beyond this kind of question, but one of the things she looked at was that she said basically religious teens, broadly speaking, have a healthier relationship with social media than non-religious teens, in the sense that they have a broader framework within which they can understand social media and their own self-worth, right? Basically, they can understand themselves, say, in a Christian sense, as a child of God, and therefore are somewhat less vulnerable to some of the, kind of happiness crushing effects that social media tends to generate, or the need to appear perfect, or all of these things. So it seems, at least in her study, to mitigate some of the negative effects of social media, which are, if you believe Jean Twenge and you believe Sherry Turkle, are fairly devastating for a lot of teens and their egos and their happiness. So in this wave, and again, keep in mind that the first wave of the National Study of Youth and Religion, we're talking here, about teenagers principally, most of them either having not graduated high school or just graduating high school recently. When we look at sexual activity in the National Study of Youth and Religion, I think not surprisingly what we see is that the devoted were far less likely to be sexually active. Where they were sexually active, they had fewer partners than the sporadics or the disengaged, and about the same number as the regulars. And whatever you believe about sexual activity, whether it's only for marriage or what have you, what's I think pretty clear from the psychological literature and the sociological literature is that delaying the onset of a person's first sexual intercourse, until at least they've sort of entered college or they're an adult, kind of keeping it as late as possible is broadly socially and psychologically beneficial to the person. And this is not particularly contested. Basically, the earlier you have sex, the more likely you are to have kind of negative psychological effects from having had sex. And again, this is not to say, anything moral or anything about people who have sex, if they're bad people. It's just that broadly, greater maturity tends to lead to better outcomes once a person starts being sexually active. And so what we can see in the devoted, at least, is that, they're basically, less of them are sexually active in their teen years. They're probably pushing it at least later, some of them to when they're married, but often probably not, if we believe, the kind of general numbers we know about who is having sex among teenagers and emerging adults. But they're doing it later, they're having fewer sexual partners, and this I think is broadly for the good. Again, regardless of what you believe from kind of a religious perspective about sex, from a psychological perspective, delaying first sexual intercourse, at least into, a person's adult years, is broadly beneficial. Okay, same thing when we talk about body image for teenagers. Broadly speaking, right, when we talk about body image, and especially with girls, we're always very concerned about this. For those who were devoted, right, 54% said they were very happy um, with their own body and physical appearance, compared to only 29% of the disengaged. Declining numbers for regulars and sporadics. How often do they feel sad or depressed? Usually or always, right? When it's still not very many across the board, only 7% on average, only 2% of the devoted, 5% of the regulars, 7% of the sporadics, 8% of the disengaged. For those who said they never felt sad or depressed, 23% of the devoted, which is obviously quite a bit higher, 9% higher than the disengaged. Feeling alone or misunderstood, they were far less likely to say, basically those who were disengaged were more than twice as likely to say they felt misunderstood as those who said they were devoted, although the differences in those middle two categories are not as big. Never feeling misunderstood or alone, over half of the devoted said that. They don't feel invisible as much, over 2/3 of the devoted said they never felt invisible, compared to only about half of the disengaged. They feel cared for by people responsible for the teen, right? Basically, 92% of the devoted said that they felt that was true a lot, versus 73% of, an almost 20% difference for those who are disengaged, and even an almost 10% difference for those who are regular. And then, basically none of them said they never felt like they were cared for, although the numbers are fairly low across the board. So generally, I think what we can say, and I won't read the rest of the chart for you, except to note that, right, basically they felt their lives were more meaningful broadly than those who are disengaged. Broadly, these are all very pro-social, very positive psychological feelings and psychological outcomes that seem to be really clustered. The positive impacts in those people who are more religious, and I think that's worth noting, right? In a world where often religion is sort of discounted, often as psychologically harmful potentially to people, and in that, it's often kind of assumed that, especially around questions of sexuality, that it causes shame. The data on teenagers, at least in this fairly detailed study, would tend to suggest the opposite. And I think that's really interesting, and I think it's really notable. Because I think it goes against maybe some of our instincts in some ways. Okay, so when we talk about relationships with adults, again, I think we see broadly some very positive numbers for the devoted as compared to the other groups here. Just like that top category, that they, felt fairly or very comfortable talking to adults other than their parents or relatives. 67% of the devoted, so over 2/3, compared to less than half of the disengaged and the sporadics, and just over half of the regulars. So these are big statistical differences. If you look at those next two categories, number of adults a teen can turn to for support, advice, help, not including parents. The number there, 8.4 total, which was considerably higher, like almost 3 percentage points higher across the board than the regulars, the sporadics, and the disengaged, which just meant that, the religiously devoted teenagers had more outlets if they needed to talk about something. Same thing for the number of supportive adults teens' parents know well enough to talk to, right? So if something's happening to, Jennifer, and, mom wants to go and figure out what's going on, mom has, on average, for the devoted, 7.3 adults that she knows, mom or dad, he or she knows well enough to go and talk to, compared to 4.6 for the regulars and only 3.4 for the disengaged, which just means there's a broader network of people who are deeply tied into that teenager's life, who can speak into what's going on and can potentially help parents work out, what might be happening, what's going on in the lives of their teenagers. Average afternoons per week spent without adult supervision, 2.1 for the devoted as compared to 2.9. And I mean, just broadly speaking, we know that teenagers who spend more time alone tend to get into more trouble generally. And average evenings per week spent without adult supervision, 1.5 compared to 2.1 for all the other categories. Again, lack of adult supervision is, one of the chief indicators of getting into trouble for teenagers, and, early sexual intercourse, more teen drinking, all of these things tend to increase the more time teenagers get to spend without adult supervision. So broadly, what we see for the devoted is they spend less time unsupervised. Maybe they're off, at youth group or other parachurch activities. But broadly, this seems to be kind of protective of them in lots of ways. So, I mean, when we look at their relationships with their families as well, what we see is across pretty much across all the categories, basically, the devoted teens tended to show better outcomes and better attitudes towards family life than their non-religious counterparts, right? I mean, just to skim a few off the top, right? They get along extremely or very well with their mother, 80% of the devoted compared to 51% of the disengaged. And the other two categories are lower than devoted as well. Have fun hanging out and doing things with mother fairly often, 2/3 versus almost just over a third for the disengaged. Feeling close to their father, 70% compared to 46% for the disengaged. Getting along with that, again, 70% versus less than half for the disengaged. They feel their parents understand them. Half of them said yes, as opposed to, less than 30% for the disengaged. They feel their parents love and accept them for who they are, 93%, so almost the whole cohort compared to 74%, less than 3/4 for the disengaged. And just on and on and on, right? Like they think their parents give them the right amount of freedom. They get along with their siblings better, right? 54% say they very well, compared to 36% of the disengaged. So, I mean, broadly, just across the board, their family lives seem to be richer, better, more loving, and more caring, in the sense that they feel better taken care of and they feel closer to the members of their family. So, I mean, when we look across kind of moral reasoning and honesty behavior, we see a lot of trends. Basically, the devoted are much more likely to feel like right and wrong are absolute, right? That there is a definitive answer to what is right and wrong as compared to the regulars, the sporadics, and the disengaged. None of those categories are even really close to the devoted, and the devoted here are drawing the average down to 45 by a significant extent because all the other groups are well above that average. I mean, so basically, what we see here is a divide between the devoted, this 8% who feel like morals are absolute, and relativistic kind of morals for everybody else. When we look at, what they would do in particular situations, right? If they were unsure if something is right or wrong in a particular situation, would they do something that helps them get ahead? Only 1% of the devoted said they would, compared to, double digits in all three other categories. Even if they're unsure about what's right in a particular situation, they would choose to do whatever makes them happy. 6% of the devoted as compared to, a quarter at the lowest for regulars, and then 40% for the disengaged. So basically, they're much more likely to consider, the consequences of their actions beyond just the immediate scope of what makes them feel good or what will help them get ahead. Less likely to have lied to parents, less likely to have cheated on a test or assignment than the other categories, although these are not always huge differences. Although lied to parents, 4% in the prior year compared to 16%, or basically 4 times as much for the disengaged. Did they do things they hoped their parents would never find out about? 22% of the disengaged said they had done things they hoped their parents would never find out about, as opposed to only 7% for the devoted. So, a triple, roughly, when you look at those categories. So broadly speaking, you see major differences in moral reasoning and honesty behavior. And you can read these, in a sense, however you want, right? It's not necessarily the case that, having a sense of morals as absolute makes you a better person. But it is a significant difference, right? It is definitely saying that religious teenagers are out of step with a lot of their other peers, and that this changes their behavior, right? They're less likely to do what they think will get them ahead or what they think will make them happy. They're more likely to consider morality in a different kind of context, which again, I think is really interesting. So broadly speaking, just asked about their attitudes towards social justice. They're much more likely than their peers. The devoted are much more likely than their peers to say they care deeply, about the needs of poor people in the United States. 2/3, as compared to only a third of the disengaged. And only 2% say they don't care at all compared to 6% for the disengaged. All of these are not huge differences. They are statistically significant. They personally care about the needs of elderly people, right? Again, about 2/3. Um, a little bit less than 2/3 for the devoted, as compared to less than half for all the other categories. And they personally care about racial equality. A little bit lower here, 62% versus less than half for all of the other three categories as well, and fewer of them said they didn't really care. Now, again, here, one of the things that is probably important to note is that the devoted, and especially if they're evangelicals, are going to have very different remedies for what they think should be done to help racial minorities in a lot of cases. That doesn't mean they don't care, though, and they tend to care about this more potentially than people who say that they are religiously disengaged. And they're far more likely also to put their care about other people into action, right? So they spend more time, or they attend on average more regular organized activities um, involved in helping people. They give more money, right? They give 65% said they give $20 of their own money, right? They're teenagers, they don't have a ton of money, to an organization or cause, as compared to less than 50% in all the other categories. They regularly do, half of them regularly volunteer or do community service, not counting required service by school or criminal justice programs. The average total number of times per month they did volunteer or work in the community is considerably higher, almost double every other category. They did volunteer or service work that brought them into contact with people of a different race at considerably higher rates than all of the other groups. And again, on and on and on. I don't need to read the whole chart out to you. Um, I think what we see pretty consistently, they are more likely to put their social justice beliefs into action than the other groups, right? And again, this is a small group. This is 8% of the teen population in the United States. So when you look at it in absolute terms, it may end up being, that it doesn't look big in terms of what you see on the surface. But in their attitudes and what they actually do with their lives, they're considerably more likely to put their social justice beliefs into action. And I think that's extremely significant. All right, so obviously religion makes a tremendous difference in the lives of teenagers, right? It changes, especially those who are the most devoted, but even for the regulars, right, there is some difference. So why don't they see it? Why don't they understand it? Why, when they ask, it's like, well, I don't know, my non-religious peers are probably just fine and about the same as me. Why was that sort of the takeaway from, the way the study is composed? Okay, I mean, basically, Smith and Denton come to this conclusion. Teenagers lack perspective about their own lives, right? And this is generally true of our perspectives about our lives in general. It's hard to see outside of our personal experiences, and our instincts often take us in the wrong direction, which is why data is so important, right? Which is why creating data-driven models is such a big thing, and sociologists tend to believe in it, you know, in major ways. And I think this study kind of shows the value of it, right? It's hard to get a large comparative viewpoint, right? You can kind of see in your own experience very limited things, and often that actually tends to take us in the wrong direction intellectually. We tend to not see the world as it is, but the world as our world seems to us based on our limited ability to bring in information. And then there's this cultural thing for American teenagers according to Smith and Denton, where they actually don't seem to think that anything influences them. There's a deep kind of sense of philosophical voluntarism that's built into American psychology, right? That I am a free agent, and that I act in a way that is completely autonomous from everything. I'm a self-defining individual. I set the terms of my own identity. And this is broadly shared, I think, by most American adults as well. Added to that, teenagers are not terribly self-reflective, right? There are whole parts of the brain that are still forming that would allow someone to really introspect. They're busy, they're, storm and stress of hormones, the challenges of getting into college. And so, I think it's fair to say that teenagers in a lot of cases are not terribly self-reflective. Um, okay, I will say, one of the things that they do warn, though they think they've controlled for it well enough, but it is worth mentioning, I think, is that there is the possibility that those who end up being devoted might be more risk averse naturally in terms of their personality type. And therefore, people who are risk averse will, broadly speaking, get better life outcomes just because they take fewer risks, right? They are less likely to do drugs or get into trouble or have sex because they're just risk averse in general. They call this reverse selection, right? Basically, that, their religion is basically ends up people who are risk takers select out of religion. So all of those people who would be engaged in risky behaviors have selected out, so you don't get those kinds of social problems. Now, Smith and Denton thinks that this might explain some of it, but they think they've controlled for a lot of factors, especially gender, well enough that this shouldn't be the case. So when trying to explain what the difference is between the devoted and all the rest of the teenagers, in terms of why their life outcomes are so different, Smith and Denton basically come up with what they call the 9 cultural factors. So they split them up in this way. Okay, so the first one is moral order. Basically, religion, they say, comes with a sense or a set of already established moral rules. And basically, these are not established by people's desires. They're not situational. So when we look at those questions on moral behavior and reasoning, one of the things that we can say is that probably why teenagers are less likely to do what makes them happy or do what gets them ahead is because they already have a kind of established set of moral rules that tell them without thinking, what they're supposed to do. So rather than sort of deciding based on personal preference or how it helps them, they're much more likely to already know what's right and wrong, at least within that moral code. So broadly speaking, they don't have to think about it, right? It's not these ad hoc decisions based on, their personal situations. They already know what's right and wrong. Okay, spiritual experiences, right? One of the things that Smith and Denton say is that they're more likely to have pinnacle moments, right? And these pinnacle moments, right, spiritual experiences in worship or in other kind of settings, basically solidify their moral commitments and constructive life practices, right? So not only are they more likely to have these kind of guiding moral orders that lead them to constructive life practices and the things that American society tends to value, right? American society tends to basically sort of reward a lot of the kind of morals and principles that are inherent in kind of long-grounded religious narrative traditions, right? Self-control, honesty, virtue, these things. Spiritual experiences ground all that in kind of a transcendent experience, thus, kind of solidifying it in the person's life and making it less likely that they're going to stray from it. They have role models, right? Number 3, they have role models in their life that show them examples of lives shaped by religious order. And typically, for the most part, these are probably going to be pretty pro-social role models, right? People who are doing great, people in their communities, people their parents know, their parents themselves, but people outside of that too, who are examples of lives well lived and who are doing well in life. Okay, now at number 4, right, they have more opportunities, especially, and churches are actually, pretty good at this. Maybe out of desperation, I don't know, but at giving young people chances to take on leadership roles and take prominent roles in the community. And just think back to the camp examples that we talked about earlier in the course, and the fact that, for emerging adults and for, older teenagers, the ability to step into, say, a kids camp and be a leader and take on a leadership role, to try out, the role of being not the object of faith, but the agent of faith. These are important things. And what tends to seem to be the case, at least to Smith and Denton, is that religious communities give young people more opportunities to sort of step into these leadership roles at younger periods. So, they get more practice at it, so that when they're stepping into the adult world, in a lot of cases, they already have, self-efficacy, right? They've already had a chance to practice self-efficacy in lots of different ways. And this is just a net benefit to them. Religion at number 5, right, offers a bunch of coping skills. And obviously, we've talked about positive and negative religious coping, but most of the major religious narratives, whatever they happen to be, have a sort of pre-packaged or preset way of dealing with hardship, right? Of dealing with things that go wrong in life, and kind of explanations, right? Whether it's to devote yourself to prayer, to meditation, to, whatever it happens to be. And obviously there's as many different answers to this as there are religions. But religions do tend to have these sorts of coping skills built in, right? I know what to do when I face death, when I face the death of a relative, the death of a friend, right? These communities have pre-constructed narratives and pre-constructed structures that are meant to help people through these experiences. So they're more likely to have kind of positive experiences coming out of this because they already know what to do. Okay. They're more likely to have chances to build cultural and social capital, right? And here, right, number 6 is related in a sense to number 4. The ability to interact with adults, to learn to speak to adults, to learn to interact with adults as a person, right, is something that religious communities actually do pretty well. And again, here, what we see with young people a lot of times is that they're extremely age stratified, right? Their lives are mostly among their peers, with the exception of a few teachers. And increasingly, there's fewer and fewer places that American teenagers interact with people outside of their age cohorts in deep and pervasive ways. Church or other religious communities are exactly such a space, right, where you have the opportunity to interact with people of all ages, people of different ages, people that you can then practice, talking to, getting them to help you with things, convincing them that you're worthwhile. And this is basically what cultural capital is. It's your ability to use your social abilities, your cultural abilities, to get people to help you. And basically, church is a place where cultural capital and the ability to practice what it's like to be an adult and to have people help you is done. Social capital at number 7. Basically, being part of a religious community means that you are already in a network of people that could potentially help you, right? It's a network that is, in a sense, around you all the time, right? And here, just as a possible example, not a real one, say you're graduating from high school and you need a summer job. Maybe there's someone in your community that runs a golf course that could get you that summer job. Or you're graduating with an engineering degree. Maybe there's someone in your church community or your religious community that it has an engineering firm or knows someone that has an engineering firm that can help you get your foot in the door. Social capital is super important for moving ahead in life. Who you know is often as important as what you know. And social capital, the social capital that's gained or freely available in churches, gives the devoted teenagers or even the regular teenagers a leg up on those who are outside of those religious communities. And just think there of the number of adults that teenagers tend to be connected to, right? If we go back a couple of slides, greater for the devoted than all the other groups, right? They have a greater kind of network of people that know them, like them, and are willing to help them. Network closure, right? And this one, again, relates to, kind of what, when we're talking about the links to adults, if you remember when I said that, their parents had a larger number of other adults who they felt comfortable talking to about their children and what's going on in their lives. That's what's called network closure. Basically, they're supervised more of the time, so they're with caring adults more of the time. And it's much more likely in a religious community that those adults are going to be able to communicate with each other about what's going on in the life of that young person, which at the end of the day means that their network is closed. There's less unsupervised time. There's less time where no one knows what's going on with them. And the adults in their lives are more likely to be able to interact with each other. And if Jennifer is having a rough time, You know, something's changed with her. They can all kind of get together and talk and figure out, oh, well, oh, she's fighting with Jenny, or, you know, she started dating Luke and then things started to go sideways. Um, this is what's called network closure, right? More adults know what's going on in this kid's life and they're sharing information. So there's not these big gaps in knowledge. And then number 9, extra community links. Basically, religious communities are connected with other religious communities. So it's easy, in a sense, to promote what a particular young person might want to do in life. Whether this is, you know, if you want to go on a missions trip, your church can hook you up with someone who does that. If you move away to college, right, good chance that they're, you know, depending on how big of a community, a religious community you're in, they might be linked to other churches in those places or know people who've gone there. You know, there's kind of links outside the community that can enable, you know, young people to do certain things, you know, take on certain, you know, tasks, or just, you know, kind of remain within that religious community, not having to step out and reinvent the wheel at the end of the day.